The person I chose to study for the Creative Person Project is Neil Gaiman. I chose him because one of my favorite movies is based off a book he wrote, and I had an opportunity to see him speak when I was in high school that I thoroughly enjoyed. I got my information from online biographies about Neil Gaiman. In addition to an official biography on his own website, I reference Encyclopedia Britannica, the Chicago Public Library biography, and notablebiographies.com. The resource that was most helpful to me was notablebiographies.com, as this website gave me a more in-depth view of who Neil Gaiman was throughout his life and provided me more details than the biography on his official website. Notablebiographies.com seemed to be a cohesive collection of facts about his life that was laid out in a generally time-specific order. I also found a few interviews on YouTube that gave me a more cohesive view of what inspired Neil Gaiman's specific style and genre of writing. Neil Gaiman was born in Portchester, England in November 10th of 1960. As a child, his love for reading was fostered through many expeditions to libraries where he spent his days while his parents were at work. Neil Gaiman described his childhood self as a feral child who was raised in libraries, and credits the librarians he came across as vital to the development for his passion of learning and reading. As a teenager, Neil Gaiman grew out of the comic books he'd loved reading at his younger years. Because there weren't any comic books available for an older audience, Gaiman was inspired to create his own, but didn't know how. Upon graduating from high school, Neil Gaiman worked as a journalist for British newspapers and magazines such as The Observer and The Sunday Times. The first book he wrote was a biography for Duran Duran in 1984, followed by a biography for Douglas Adams, author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Gaiman and his partner, Mary Grath, had their first child, Michael, in 1983. He married McGrath in 1985, and they had their second child, Holly. This is when Gaiman really started writing his short stories. In 1987, Neil Gaiman teamed up with Dave McKean to create the graphic novel series Violent Cases. The success of their work led to Neil's rise in the comic book industry, and the addition of the Black Orchid miniseries to DC's collection secured the ominous tone for his later comics. Gaiman created and launched Sandman through DC in 1989, which immediately became a big hit. Neil Gaiman's first novel was Good Omens in 1990, which he wrote in collaboration with fellow English author Terry Pratchett. The two would take turns writing chapters, then calling each other to discuss what they liked and edit what they didn't, before passing the baton. Eventually, the humorous apocalypse tale would become a bestseller. Neil Gaiman moved to the United States in 1992 and currently resides outside of Minneapolis. There, and throughout his travels, he continued writing his bestseller, Neverwhere, which came out in 1996. Stardust originated as a 4-part comic series for DC, but also released as a novel in 1999. American Gods followed in 2001, and the children's book Coraline in 2002. Stardust and Coraline both received movie adaptations due to their success in the early 2000s. Gaiman continued to write, revisiting American Gods characters with Anansi Boys in 2006. Then, in 2008, he produced The Graveyard Book, another spooky children's book that later received a Newbery Award, among others, in 2009. Revisiting his comic career, in 2004, Neil wrote 1602 for Marvel Comics, which led him into the world of superheroes. Gaiman's work with Marvel also includes the Eternals miniseries, which was published in 2006. From time to time, Neil Gaiman revisited his old Sandman comics in DC, bringing sort of a prequel series forward in 2013 through 2015 that was illustrated by J.H. Williams III. Most recently, Neil Gaiman has released a novel adaptation of Norse myths named Norse Mythology. Additionally, American Gods was translated into television with a Stars show, and Good Omens premiered as a miniseries on Amazon. Gaiman has also written scripts for TV and movies, including 2 episodes of his childhood favorite show, Doctor Who, the episodes Doctor's Wife in 2011 and Nightmare in Silver in 2013. The main sequence of events in Neil Gaiman's life that led to his creativity was his love for reading as a child. Once he became infatuated with reading and the worlds that books could provide him and other readers, he became interested in creating his own. This was seen in his teenage years with his desire to create a comic book for older audiences. Then, when he graduated high school, he became a journalist in order to develop his skill and get a foot in the door of the writing profession. Gaiman's graphic novel debut of Violent Cases and work for DC Comics helped him realize his dream of creating more grown-up comic books. After writing the Duran Duran biography and collaborating with Terry Pratchett on Good Omens, Gaiman's novel writing career kicked off and he was able to use his creativity to its full extent. One of my favorite stories of Neil Gaiman's is his inspiration for Coraline. His daughter wanted to hear a scary story, but Neil's usually dark-themed creations were maybe a bit too much for a young girl. Off he went to the bookstore, asking the workers if there were any scary books for kids. Upon receiving weird looks and no's, he turned to his own creativity and wrote about a girl who discovers an alternate world where people have buttons for eyes. Gaiman's big sacrifice was moving his family to the United States. While England had a receptive target audience, you can imagine that the States had a bigger market in addition to being where both DC and Marvel comics were based. One of Neil Gaiman's values that guides him is trying to stick to the essence of the myths he portrays while still writing his own version of the stories. Because of this, countless hours of research and revision went into writing works such as Norse mythology, American gods, and more. Notable biographies describes his influences for Sandman comics as an everything but the kitchen sink mindset, where he included elements of Greek myths, myths of his own invention, and even some of the Jewish texts from his childhood. Neil Gaiman has a very light and playful attitude about life. In one of his essays, Where Did You Get Your Ideas?, he describes how he used to tell people silly answers to that very question. When reading through the essay, you can tell that Gaiman is not taking himself too seriously in his response. I make them up, he says, out of my head. He also shows a great deal of admiration for the people he has collaborated with. On his site, Neil Gaiman has written essays to both Terry Pratchett and Dave McKean. He also shows his admiration for the creativity of Edgar Allan Poe through his essay on that topic for Barnes & Noble's interview. Additionally, Neil Gaiman posts lighthearted tweets on social media, including references to a known parody news site, TheOnion.com. His stories and comics themselves often paint a different, darker picture, though. Gaiman's comics tend to fall into the horror category, while Coraline and The Graveyard Book are scarier than most children's books. The libraries and librarians Neil Gaiman visited as a child influenced his love of reading and most likely sparked his interest in becoming an author. He is credited as saying that he was basically raised in libraries, which adds to their importance in his life at the time. C.S. Lewis was one of Gaiman's authors of choice to read in his youth. According to a video interview with Bloomsbury Publishing, Gaiman was inspired to become an author after reading the Narnia series. 6-year-old Neil noticed the conversational way that C.S. Lewis wrote his books and realized for the first time that it may be fun to become an author himself. Edgar Allan Poe was one of Gaiman's authors of choice to read as his youth as well. I believe this could have had a major influence on the darkness that can be found in Gaiman's works. Poe's poems are famous for their mysterious and ominous aura, which may have led Gaiman to gravitate towards the horror and scary story genre. Comic books were yet another major influence in Gaiman's life. Due to his love of reading as a child and discovering that there were fewer options for teens as he grew up, Neil was inspired to create his own comics. Additionally, Gaiman's comic career was influenced by the work of Alan Moore. In his video interview, Neil Gaiman claims that Alan Moore's Swamp Thing comic was one of the books that changed his life, bringing back his enthusiasm for writing comics that he had previously abandoned as a teenager. Notable biographies quotes Neil as saying that Moore's work convinced me that you could really do work in comics that had the same amount of intelligence, the same amount of passion, the same amount of quality that you could put in any other medium. Being able to read the works of Moore gave Gaiman the motivation he needed to start his own comics. This desire continued into his adulthood, where he eventually realized his dream by working with both DC and Marvel, two powerful players in the comic book realm. On the other hand, there are some negative influences in his writing career. Neil Gaiman is very aware of respecting the cultures of the populations he is writing about. In an interview with Bloomberg's Publishing, Neil calls himself a myth junkie and states that he loves myths, all of which are wonderful and deserve to be retold. For example, in his youth, Neil Gaiman was fascinated by Marvel's Thor comics and really fell in love with Norse myths when reading a book at his friend's house. When he became an adult, he put his love of Norse myths to work in his retelling Norse mythology. A New York Times article quotes Gaiman as saying, "I am trying to write a book that a Norse scholar is not going to go, he's got it so completely wrong." This statement proves that Neil is sensitive and respectful of the cultures he is representing. However, he still worries about misrepresenting them, which can be a negative influence on his writing. In addition to staying true to the myths of countries he has not lived in, Gaiman is worried about what people would think in relation to portraying America in American Gods. He uploaded an essay on his website titled "How Dare You" in 2001, expressing that he was always afraid he would be asked this question as he is an Englishman writing about nuances of American mythology and life. He admits that it's a bit strange, being that he had only lived in the States for 8 years up until that point, but then emphasizes the fact it's more about the immigrant experience in the United States. This he can relate to. In researching his material, he then took various trips to roadside attractions in small towns in order to craft his work. Despite the book's success, this could be considered a negative influence as it was a gnawing question Gaiman had to overcome in order to succeed. The event that had the strongest influence on the development of Neil Gaiman's creativity is reading Alan Moore's Swamp Thing comic. After being disheartened as a teenager due to the lack of comic material as a teen, Swamp Thing showed Gaiman that it is possible to make comics for adults, and that it was relatively like writing novels, which he had already begun doing. From there, he was able to rekindle his motivation to create his own comics, which led him again to work with DC and Marvel. If an event is to spark such a rebirth in passion and lead to such great success, it must be strongly influential. Neil Gaiman experienced the internal pressure of imposter syndrome when coming up with ideas for American Gods. As stated before, Neil had to make sure that what he was writing honored the cultures that they were about. At times, he even questioned his own reasoning for writing about them. Neil faces the external pressure of continuing to write and producing books or comics. His latest novel was Norse mythology in 2017, but he has published several illustrated children's books since then, including one in 2020 called Pirate Stew. Gaiman continues working on TV shows and movies, especially since the Graveyard Book movie is currently in development. Another internal pressure is Neil Gaiman's writing process. He likes to write fountain pen to paper, usually with multiple ink colors, which shows a physical representation of how much he has accomplished each session. This can turn into a pressure as he is forced to face the amount of work he is able to complete each time he sits down to write. In order to deal with the internal pressure of imposter syndrome, Neil made sure he was well versed in the myths he was portraying. For Norse mythology, Gaiman made sure he was reflecting the essence of the myth while putting his modern spin on them. For American Gods, Neil spent time and money on road trips throughout the United States to truly experience roadside attractions and the immigrant lifestyle. In order to combat the external pressure of expected to continue to write, Gaiman sets himself rules. In an interview with Tim Ferriss, Gaiman described his writing process as allowing himself to write or to do nothing at all. Only those two options. Well, after a while of doing nothing, it becomes less appealing, so he turns to writing in order to fill his time. Gaiman faces the internal pressure of his writing process by embracing it. He finds joy in using the different colors and then reviewing his progress. When he edits, he is able to transfer directly from the paper by typing it up. This saves him time in the editing process, as he is simply able to decide to not type up a certain dissatisfying portion, and it quickly gives him a second draft. This could also help with the external pressure of continuing to write, because Neil Gaiman is able to supply his publishers with more material at a rapid pace.